I want to suggest that the Shroud of Turin, despite all the claims surrounding it, is, in my opinion, a blatant forgery, a counterfeit, a piece of historical and enduring modern fake news. Now, this is not just because of personal skepticism or the scientific method that is being used or carbon dating, but simply that, in my opinion, it does not align with the eyewitness testimony that we find in Scripture.
Wow, he tells it like it is, right? It is a blatant forgery, this Shroud of Turin. And it doesn't align with the eyewitness testimony of Scripture. In his opinion, case closed. So what do you think? Is he right? You know, you can never just go by somebody's word. And so I'm not asking you to take his word for it, my word for it. The goal of the Bible Rethink channel is for us to dig beneath the surface. Follow the evidence, ask the hard questions, and let the truth speak for itself. My name is Kenny Panis from the Bible Rethink channel, also a pastor in Fountain Valley. And today we're going to follow the evidence for one of the most remarkable objects that's ever been studied, the Shroud of Turin. That's what I want to talk about on this edition of the Midweek Snack. Stay tuned. The Shroud of Turin. It's been called many things, a miracle, a mystery, and by many of its critics, a blatant fake news forgery. And so with Resurrection Sunday just around the corner, some people call it Easter, I want to talk about one of the most studied, most debated, most fascinating objects in human history, the Shroud of Turin. And the question that has divided scientists, historians, archaeologists, and theologians for centuries: is this the burial cloth of Jesus? And I want to start from the beginning. This is the Shroud of Turin that you're looking at. It's 14 feet long, 3.5 feet wide, plus some change on each side of that equation. A linen cloth with a distinctive herringbone twill weave. A rare and expensive pattern that was only found in the ancient world. And on it, if you really look and locate, there's a faint impression of a human body, front and back, as if a man lay down on one half of the cloth and the other half of the cloth was folded over him. The hands are folded over his torso, which is consistent, by the way, of a first century Jewish burial practice. And for 19 centuries, this was it. A whisper of an image that drew millions, that people believe was the burial cloth of Jesus. But in 1898, an Italian photographer named Seconda Pia was given the rare privilege, and I do mean rare by this because scientists, photographers, they've only had access to the shroud. You could probably count it on one hand. So he photographs, he sets up his camera, he makes his exposures, he's heading to the dark room, and he slides the glass negative plate into the developing tray and watched as an image slowly came into focus. And he would go on to say that he nearly dropped his negative plate. Why? Because here's what he saw. Staring back at him was a negative. From this negative was a perfect. It was detailed, anatomically precise image of a man. There were clear facial features. There's a beard, closed eyes, wounds. It's the kind of image that would have appeared on the cloth itself. It should have appeared on the cloth itself Instead, it appeared in the negative. Light and dark reversed. Which means that when you photograph a negative, you get a positive. You get what Pia saw. Nobody in the 14th century had any concept of a photographic negative because photography wouldn't be invented for another 500 years. I mean, the image itself, it shouldn't exist. But here's where it gets even stranger. There was a man named Pete Schumacher who was working with a team called STIRP, and they did what's known as a VP image analyzer. Now, they didn't have access to the shroud, but they had access to photos of the shroud. And so they also compared some other samples, and I'm going to show you this video clip. It's about 2 minutes, because I want you to see the process. It's better to see it visually. So here we go.
But scientists were not given the opportunity to look more closely at the shroud. Another 40 years would pass before they made another major breakthrough using a new high-tech image analyzer called a VP8. Peter Schumacher was a field engineer for the team that created the VP8, which was originally designed to analyze images from medical resources and satellites.
Nobody in our company had ever even heard of the Shroud of Turin, let alone seen pictures or wanted to look at image analysis of the Shroud of Turin.
What the VP8 analyzer does is plot the light and dark areas of an image onto a 3D grid. In the mid-70s, two American scientists, Eric Jumper and Joe Jackson at the U.S. Air Force Academy, heard about this new technology and asked Schumacher to use it to examine a photograph of the shroud. We asked Schumacher to recreate that test for us so we could see exactly what it was that excited shroud scientists 30 years ago. We placed 3 images under the analyzer: a self-portrait of the great master Leonardo da Vinci, a photograph of one of our crew members, and the 1931 photograph of the Shroud of Turin. First, Schumacher examined the charcoal self-portrait of Leonardo da Vinci to show how the analyzer reacts to a drawing or painting, which some have argued is exactly what the Shroud of Turin is.
If it was painted, it would look like the Da Vinci, which came out basically looking like noise. It's a fairly bland contrast.
Next, we wanted to see what a regular photograph looked like under the VP8, so we tested a picture of one of our crew members.
If we look, Jim's cheeks really aren't that flat. His eyebrows are not really grooved into his forehead. His nose really doesn't smear all over his face.
This is what every photograph looks like under the VP8. It is not rendered with real height or depth, the things that make up a true 3D image. But when a picture of the shroud is placed on the analyzer, something remarkable happens.
All of a sudden, we're seeing contrast that has something to do with height and depth, real distance. The nose has a prominence, the cheeks roll off, the hair has a shape to it and is rounded. The whole image has dimension to it.
Schumacher's results deepened the mystery started by Secondo Pia. How had this image formed on the shroud?
The shroud is a very unique image, the only one of its kind in the whole world. Nothing else like it. 3-dimensional relief, the front and the back of a whole human being. Only one in the world. No other, nowhere, no how, no way. I don't know any way to make it. I've never heard of a way to make it. Just the Shroud of Turin.
Boy, you got to love that reaction, right? It's like, it's from Pete Schumacher, right? The man that ran the test himself. his expression, his countenance, it tells you everything. What the VP8 revealed is the image on the shroud, it doesn't encode light and shadow like a regular photograph does. It encodes distance. So every point on the cloth corresponds to how far the body was from the linen at the exact spot. So if you look at this 3D formation here, closer areas are going to be brighter, and recessed areas like the eyelids are going to be darker. And so you can see it like in the nose and the forehead and the cheekbones. These places that come across lighter, it's spatial to the cloth 3D formation here. It's not light and shadows like photography, 2D photography. So it's a perfect spatial map of the human body. And no photograph can do that. No painting can do that. No technique known to exist in any century can deliberately encode 3D spatial information into a flat cloth image. So two images, the painting and the photograph, they went flat. They had flaws from a 3D perspective. But the shroud went 3D. And that's just the first piece of evidence. You make of that what you will. But it was actually a remarkable find, and it led to a formation of a group of scientists known as STURP, which stands for the Shroud of Turin Research Project. And that opened the gate. So we got to find this image. We got to test it. We got to see, maybe there's something in here. Again, this was from a photograph. And NASA uses this for like mapping the moon and the craters and the depth. You just don't find that on a picture, on a painting. But what about the wounds? Well, modern imaging technology comes into place here because it reveals something that generally surprised modern researchers. False color imaging here. It shows us the puncture wounds that are distributed around his entire scalp. Not a single band. Remember the images that you have? They're often medieval paintings, by the way, of just kind of a wreath around Jesus. A crown of thorns, you think of a band. Well, this image right here, it isn't a band, but it's actually like a cap of thorns that have been placed on his head like a helmet. And you can see exactly where those thorns made contact. If you look at the nose, you can see that there's been some trauma there. The bridge of his nose, it shifts slightly to one side. And it's the kind of imagery, obviously, that comes from blows to the face. This one only became visible because of modern imaging technology. The scourge marks. There were so many of them. Researcher Giulio Fonte, his responsibility was to map every identifiable scourge mark on the shroud. There are 159 that are on the front of his body and 213 on the back, 372 individual wounds. These wounds are dumbbell-shaped, and they are consistent with what we know about the Roman flagrum, the whip with the small lead and the bone weights at the tip. It's consistent with it. And there's two distinct width patterns that suggest that there were two soldiers that were striking this individual from opposite sides. And if you look closely, the wounds cluster beneath the shoulder blades, which is consistent of somebody that was like hugging a pole or a post as he was getting whipped on repeatedly. So that's just the flogging here. But what about the side wound? Well, the shroud records that, and it also records two distinct flows of fluids. And the reason they know that is because STURP had access to the shroud for 5 straight days, and they brought all their equipment, 8 tons of equipment. And the fluid is consistent with what doctors call pericardial effusion, which is a big fancy word that sounds nice, but it means basically a punctured heart sac. And I want you to think about this for a second. In John 19:34, we know about a story where a soldier pierces the side of Jesus and immediately blood and water come out. The shroud and the eyewitness testimony of John line up on this party. So, you just have to ponder that. This shroud, this thing that appeared faint now, is revealing more and more to us. And because Stirrup had access to this, they had the ability to study the blood on the shroud at a microscopic level. So this really changed the game here, because the bloodstains consisted of real human blood. There was an argument, this was a painting, this was pigments, this was something that was forged in the medieval period. But the blood is real blood. And a type is AB. And that blood type has been confirmed by multiple independent analysis. And the reason why type AB is significant is because it's rare. It's found in only 2 to 3% of the general population. And it occurs disproportionately, check this out, among Jewish populations that live in the Middle East. It's the exact kind of geographical and ethnic profile that you would want if you wanted to argue that that is the burial cloth of Jesus. So again, this cloth becomes even more intriguing as you study the evidence. The blood also shows what's known as elevated blood levels of what's called bilirubin, which is a compound that your liver produces when the red blood cells break down under extreme physical stress. And these levels are consistent, say the medical professionals, with a man who was severely beaten and tortured. It just released high elevated levels of bilirubin from the liver. There's a detail that actually changes everything. The blood was on this cloth before the image formed. The blood was on the cloth before the image formed. Now just bear with me for a second. I want to be clear about something. Everybody knows that if there's a human body that's bleeding and you cover him with a cloth, the blood will be there before the body. The blood will touch the cloth before the body touches the cloth. Because a wounded man bleeds, right? That's obvious. He's laid in the cloth, and of course the blood was there first. But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the image that you see of this crucified man. So that faint chemical change that's on the cloth, that discoloration that forms separately from the blood, that is what came after the blood. And that is what's remarkable about this finding. There's an image that has a faint discoloration on the outer surface of the cloth, but it is not the blood itself. It is completely a separate phenomenon. A chemical change to the outermost fibers on the other side of the cloth that happened at some point either during or after the burial. It's on the other side of the cloth that the face was wrapped. The blood got there when the body was placed under the cloth. The image, entirely different. And the question is, how do we know what came first? Because Stirrup answered the question. The scientists and the forensic people, they physically remove blood flakes from beneath the cloth. And they examined the fibers that were underneath. And what they found was bare linen, the same color that the cloth was always before that image formed. There was no image coloring on all of the blood that they were able to flake off and put under a microscope. There was no image coloring at all. It's like the blood became a sticker, if you will. The image itself exists on every fiber around each blood stain, and it exists right up to the edge. And then stops cold. It doesn't cross the boundary. It's like this image here where you see the circles and you see the formation of the image, but it doesn't go inside the boundaries. It just goes right to the boundary line and it stops. The blood is the timestamp. That whatever caused that image, it happened after the blood was already there. It's a huge discovery. And it just opens up a whole can of worms. Because it's almost like this image that formed knew the blood was already there in the first place. And that blood and that image that you see there was one fiber deep. So Stirrup also examined the image at a microscopic level. And they found something that was technically astonishing about the entire shroud. That image that I'm talking about, that's how small it is compared to the fiber. A human hair is 70 microns wide. This linen has 0.2 microns on it. So the image depth is 350 times thinner than a strand of hair. You can't make this stuff up. And because the chemical change is so superficial, meaning it's not deep at all, it's 0.2 microns. And it's so precise. The image that you see, the face and the hands and the eyes, and that image stops at every blood stain. Scientists have confirmed whatever caused it had to have been instantaneous. It couldn't have been slow heat or gradual aging, but one burst of energy in and out before the energy could penetrate any deeper. The Italian National Agency of New Technologies, they're known as ENEA, they weren't trying to reproduce the shroud, but they had one specific goal in mind. Could they use a laser to produce the same discoloration of the linen fibers? So they're not trying to produce the image of the shroud, but they're just trying to see if they can produce something that's 0.2 microns surface edge that has the same kind of color as the shroud. And they fired one of the most powerful UV lasers at these small samples, which were the size of a postage stamp. And they said they got close to reproduce the same effect across a full 14 of the shroud. There's a scientist named Paolo Di Lazzaro who calculated it would require 34 billion watts of ultraviolet radiation in under 50 nanoseconds. And the scientists concluded, unexplained. We just can't explain that kind of energy and power, and so quickly. 50 nanoseconds is a 50 billionths of a second. The closest comparison in the natural world is what happened at Hiroshima. On the morning of August 6, 1945, there was a person that was sitting outside the steps of a bank, waiting for it to open, just waiting patiently. And at 8:15 a.m., the atomic bomb was detonated 260 meters away from that individual sitting on those steps. And a burst of radiant energy that was so instantaneous and so intense happened that it bleached the entire stairs white. But the stone beneath the person remained the same. It's the only thing that comes close to explaining what's on the shroud. National Geographic described this event, this person's image, as like a photo of a negative. It's the same language used to describe the Shroud of Turin. And the difference, of course, is the direction, because Hiroshima's energy comes from the outside and above. The shroud's image suggests that the energy came from within the cloth. It projected outward through the cloth, scorching only the top outermost layers of the exterior surface. A body, a cloth, an instantaneous event, and an image that left behind what we still cannot explain today, 2,000 years later. A burst of energy that was so brief, it only touched the surface. And if it's the burial cloth of Jesus, it was in a sealed tomb on a Sunday morning. So as a pastor, I can't help but wonder about the radiant energy that Jesus must have displayed on Mount Hermon during his transfiguration. When he walked through the door after his resurrection, because his disciples were hiding and they locked the door, he just went right through it. Images in Revelation that describe him. I wonder, what kind of power was that? And now I have to think about it in the tomb. And I already know that the tomb had earthquakes happening and thunder and lightning. There was power source that was going off there. And if this shroud is actually the burial cloth of Jesus, he just went right through it and he just left an image there for us to ponder. Man, that sounds beautiful, doesn't it? But something significant happened that put a wrench on all of this a decade later. The 1988 carbon dating. And I'm going to let Dr. Timothy Jewell, who was one of the people that did the experiments, explain what happened and what the results were.
The first step in any carbon dating process is to burn or combust the material being tested. Cutting a piece from the shroud that would be permanently destroyed was a highly controversial action, so the sample was cut from a corner that was already severely damaged.
It was a convenient choice. It was in an area of a cloth that nobody was going to complain about. Nobody was going to take issue with the fact that they're pulling threads from the more pristine parts of the cloth.
The section removed from the damaged corner was divided into 4 separate samples. One piece of the shroud was sent to Oxford University, another to the Swiss Institute of Technology in Zurich, and 2 smaller pieces were sent to the University of Arizona, where Dr. Tim Jull was a member of the original carbon dating team.
Everybody and all the plants and all the animals on the surface of this planet have approximately the same amount of carbon-14 in them as long as they're alive. When we die, the C14 in our bodies decays with a known decay rate. If we measure the carbon-14 in the sample and compare it to a standard, we can calculate the age from the ratio of the sample to the standard.
First, the shroud sample was cleaned of any impurities. Then, it was literally burned up.
We start off with a piece of linen and we combust it at this end, turning the carbon of that sample into a gaseous state.
The CO2 gas is then solidified and turned into graphite, or pure carbon. Each graphite sample is shot through an accelerating mass spectrometer, which can then count each individual carbon-14 atom.
This particle detector can count 1 atom at a time. For a modern sample, we count upwards of 100 atoms per second. For an old sample, one that's close to 50,000 years, we may count 5 or 10 atoms in 2 minutes.
From the number that passed through, scientists are able to accurately find a date. For the Shroud of Turin test, each lab worked secretly and independently of the other, and yet each came up with the same range of dates.
We wanted to make sure we were right, so we measured it more times than we would regularly, and we knew that it wouldn't be 2,000 years old after 5 minutes. The Shroud of Turin turned out to be a medieval sample from the 14th century, and that's what the radiocarbon date shows.
Isn't that heartbreaking? There were many people that really revered this cloth. There were many people that would travel miles to see it, and they really thought it was the burial cloth of Jesus. But the carbon dating said this was medieval. Dr. Jules said we knew that within 5 minutes. What a letdown. And the skeptics rejoiced. And as far as they were concerned, this case is officially closed. Move on to better things. It was medieval forgery. Or was it? Because we still have unexplained questions about the sample that was being used by carbon dating to begin with. They believe that the sample that was used was a patch. It wasn't part of the main cloth. In fact, as you do some research, you can find out that there was something known as French invisible reweaving. It's a technique where you can take old fibers and new fibers, and you can intertwine them together so that they produce a cloth that to the naked eye is undetectable that they are separate pieces of cloth. So a married couple named Joe Marino and Sue Benford, they spent many years investigating what French reweaving was. And they did all kinds of computer analysis, and Benford finally cracked the case. She identified the reweaving pattern in the tested corner. So if that reweaving is what happened, then the carbon date is skewed towards the 14th century, even if the main cloth itself is 2,000 years old. Benford and Marino, they made a compelling case, but they weren't scientists. They needed someone that had real credibility to confirm or deny what their findings were. And that someone was Ray Rogers, a chemist from Los Alamos and one of the original STIRP researchers. But Rogers wasn't sympathetic to their theory. He actually wanted to disprove it in 5 minutes and move on. But here's the problem. He couldn't. When he examined the samples, he found the cotton fibers exactly where Benford and Marino said that the reweaving would be, and nowhere else on the shroud. So Rogers was convinced, but he knew he still needed more. To settle the carbon dating question, he had to get his hands on the documented fiber from the actual 1988 test sample and compare it with the main cloth. Here he is explaining that whole process.
Until I could get a sample from the real radiocarbon cloth, a documented sample, I couldn't prove anything.
The carbon dating process destroys the sample as part of the dating procedure. But all the labs involved in 1988 had held on to a small sample as a reserve.
The authentic radiocarbon sample that I got, these segments of yarn were cut from the middle of the radiocarbon sample, so there was no question about them. And when I looked at these samples from the radiocarbon area, there's no problem at all finding cotton in them.
Rogers was now convinced that Benford and Marino had been right. In fact, he found other evidence they had missed, which proved the shroud had been repaired with cotton fibers in exactly the section where the carbon dating samples had been taken.
If you happen to hit a place where a yarn segment from the original shroud was spliced into the new reweave part, the splice, very definitely shows the new yarn that was being put in and dyed to match. The only thing in the shroud that was dyed or stained was this radiocarbon area. So my hypothesis at the moment is that this was done on purpose to fool your eye.
And he even wrote a peer-reviewed paper confirming that cotton fibers were found on the samples, but they were not present on the main body of the shroud, because the shroud was made of linen. The cotton didn't belong there in the first place. And so here you have this soap opera going back and forth. It's a fake. No, it's real. No, it's fake. This proves it. No, it doesn't. Welcome to the Shroud of Turin. It's the mystery that many people have just wanted to solve but haven't quite been able to get there. I asked Joe Marino, Sue Benford's husband, what he thought about it through an email. And he said evidence shows that the carbon-14 test was poorly done and that the sample chosen was not homogeneous. It is unknown what another carbon-14 test would show. I like that he admits that. But the 1988 one cannot be considered good evidence that the shroud is a medieval forgery. I agree with him. I mean, the proof is in the pudding. So that's where we are today. And there's been some new tests. There's called a wax test, and it tested the fibers, and it said that the cloth was from the 1st century. But a lot of this information is new. But that's where we are. Some people believe it, some people don't believe it. And so I just want to end this section on, let's get back to the scriptures. What do the scriptures think? When we watched David Bisley at the beginning, he said, definitely it contradicts scripture. It is fake news. Well, one of the most common objections between theologians and scholars and pastors is the belief that Jesus was actually buried in burial strips, like a mummy, and that the shroud can't qualify for being the burial cloth of Jesus because the shroud is just one large cloth. It can't be the burial cloth. But I want to look at what the Gospels tell us about the cloth, because Scripture always has to be our final authority in every matter of life. Even when some things seem to contradict it, it has to be our ultimate authority. So in the book of Mark, chapter 15, verse 46, he writes about the burial here. And he says, Joseph bought a linen cloth and took him down, referring to Jesus, wrapped him in a linen cloth and laid him in a tomb which had been hewn out of the rock, and he rolled the stone against the entrance of the tomb. Now, the Greek word that's used for linen cloth here is sindon. And sindon means one thing, and one thing only when you look it up: a large linen cloth. It's not strips, it's one cloth. And the word actually is the root word of syndonology, which is the academic study of the shroud itself. So when it comes to this word that I just mentioned here, sindon, it's found in the synoptic gospels. Matthew, Mark, and Luke uses it for the burial of Jesus. So that means one person doesn't, and that's John. And here's where the controversy starts to go when it comes to interpretation. In John 19:40, he writes, "So they took the body of Jesus and bound it in linen wrappings." That's a plural term. "With the spices, as is the burial custom of the Jews." So now John tells us the same story, but he uses a different word. He doesn't use sindon. He uses the word ENEA. And that is a collective term for the complete set of burial linens there. Every linen that was used for the preparation. So you think of it like this, that the linens are the burial cloth and the face cloth, and then there's even wraps that you can wrap your hand and your around your face and to keep your jaw shut. And there's a lot of loose things that are also part of this package. So the term is a collective term. So think about bedding. What do you have in bedding? You have sheets, you have blankets, you have pillows, you have pillowcases. These are your beddings. It's not one specific cloth. John is not contradicting the other three writers. He's just using a broader term that encompasses the whole burial package. But how do we know for sure John doesn't mean strips? It's because John uses that word in a different context that involves burial, but not Jesus, Lazarus. In John 11:44, it says, "The man who died came forth, bound hand and foot with wrappings, and his face was wrapped around with a cloth," which is called a sudarian, by the way, a face cloth. Jesus said to him, "Unbind him." So he's bound with something, right? He's bound. There's more to the burial package than just a shroud or a face cloth. Unbind him and let him go. And the word that he used here is called keriaios. Keriaios means narrow binding strips. It's the mummy burial. John knew exactly what they look like, and he knew how to describe them because he's very good with words. And he chose a completely different word for Jesus. So if Jesus had been buried in strips the way Lazarus was, John would have said keriaios. But he didn't. These were not the same kind of burial. And it just reminds me that when it comes to the shroud and when it comes to these debates, people see things from their own perspective. Many people, including Christians, they look at everything that we've just talked about and examined, and they come up with different conclusions. And that's okay. Because the shroud works the same way. The naked eye, when they look at it, they almost see nothing, just a faint whisper of an image. A photographic negative that comes now all of a sudden reveals that there's a face behind this cloth. A VP analyzer analyzes and reveals that this person, this body that's imaged is there, it's three-dimensional. It's not a painting. An ultraviolet light reveals bloodstain patterns that are invisible in normal light. The same evidence is shown for everyone. And what you see depends on the framework that you actually bring to it. So I started this episode as a detective. So let me give you a detective's verdict. In a criminal case, the standard is reasonable doubt. And in a civil case, it's preponderance of the evidence. I can't say beyond reasonable doubt that this is the Shroud of Turin at this juncture in my life. The carbon dating issue needs to be resolved. A new test needs to be done on the main body of the cloth. Secondly, the documentation of the shroud is thinner than you would expect if in fact people have always thought this is the burial cloth of Jesus. We have instances, we have a face cloth in northern Spain that appears to match the wounds. It's compelling. We have an illustration called the Hungarian Prey manuscript that has a painting of what appears to be the shroud and Jesus being resurrected. And it has, of all things, a herringbone twill weave, the same kind that the shroud has today. but the rest of the documentation is sparse. And I can't understand that. So I think those are the two biggest weaknesses for myself. But when it comes to the preponderance of the evidence, I think it really weighs heavily that there's a lot of evidence out there that points that this is the first burial cloth, first century. The depth of the image of the cloth is astonishing, right? 0.2 microns. The blood that predates the image, I mean, come on. The 3D spatial encoding, the photographic negative that Sagunda Pia found out and nearly dropped his plate. Yeah, the scales, they tip toward the first century for me there. And so the strengths are real, but there are also weaknesses. And both of these issues deserve to be on the table and discussed and talked about, because that's what an honest investigation looks like. But thankfully, my faith doesn't depend on this cloth. The resurrection stands on its own testimony. The empty tomb, the appearances, the transformed disciples, the explosion of the early church, Jesus present in our world today and also in our lives, in my life. But if the shroud appears to be what everybody says it is, at least those that are really committed, then somewhere in a tomb outside of Jerusalem, Jesus left us the most meaningful selfie the world has ever seen. It's true. It happened. So now I want to hear from you. Where do you stand on the Shroud of Turin? Is it forgery? Is it authentic? Is it somewhere in between? Let me know in the comments section and tell me why, please. Because the conversation is the whole point. And I like to respond. And I love to hear different perspectives. Also, if this episode made you rethink some things, please consider subscribing and hitting that button. It helps the algorithm, it helps the content get out there. Because there are some people that are asking questions and they want to dig deeper. My name is Kenny Panis. I'm from the Bible Rethink. And I just want to wish you a fantastic and meaningful Holy Week. And then ultimately, Resurrection Sunday. Some call it Easter. Until next time, I just pray that you have a great experience this Holy Week. God bless everybody. Take care.